Yep, it's the annual CPAC conference, and today falls on day 30 of the Trump administration being in power. And boy, they have been moving at breakneck speed on a variety of issues, including one that Trump promised during the campaign and actually for the previous 2 years that he would address, namely the war in Ukraine. And as you well know, negotiations have begun. He spoke at length on the phone to Vladimir Putin, and the teams met in Saudi Arabia earlier on this week. J.D. Vance this morning speaking here at the conference, backing up that the aim and the objective that the Americans have is to be the broker for a lasting peace. But there were some comments that Trump made yesterday about Zelenskyy from Ukraine that have led to, well, let's say, some degree of controversy. But let me ask you at home, is peace on the way? What do you think? Farage at GBNews.com. What I would say is we haven't heard everything yet. It's slightly premature to rush to judgment on what this will look like by the end. This is a process, it's a negotiation, it's going to take weeks, maybe months to fully complete. What would be good is if we could head towards a ceasefire at some point in the next few weeks. Do I agree with every single word the president says? Look, the old saying, and it's true, you should always take Trump seriously, but not necessarily always take him literally. And all I can say is thank goodness somebody is trying to look for a peace deal after nearly 3 years and something like 1 million battle casualties. Just think about that for a moment. Joining me here live at CPAC, K.T. McFarlane, former Deputy National Security Advisor to this great country, author, many other things, and someone that knows Donald Trump's mind and the way that he works pretty well. Well, he said he'd attempt peace. Is he off to a good start?
Oh, he's off to a fantastic start. I mean, if you think back to the Biden administration, they said they had determined, well, we could never trust Vladimir Putin to keep a deal, therefore we're never going to sit down and negotiate with him. And so what's the answer? Well, we're just going to keep going on and on and on. And a forever war that's going to be frozen, a war of attrition. President Trump comes in and says, well, if you're going to have a deal, you got to sit down at the table, so let's talk. And I think that's where he's going. And, somebody told me once, and this is a way of really understanding President Trump, he's a real estate developer.
Yep.
He doesn't think in terms of 6 months, 12 months, a year. He thinks in terms of 20 years. So he's looking at Ukraine, and he's thinking, what's the long game here? Ukraine isn't going to win a war against Russia. It's never going to happen, no matter how much aid you give them. But Ukraine could win the peace. Now, how do they win the peace?
Yeah.
Because we go in and help them develop their rare earth minerals and a lot of their natural resources.
I mean, look, America could go in, could develop mineral resources. It could be good for American companies. Equally, if the deal's right, very, very good for the Ukrainian economy as well. And I get that, and I understand that. I guess the biggest problem here, and nuances and perceptions are different. There's a very big ocean between yourselves and Europe, whereas for Poland, for the Baltic states, for others, this is happening right on their doorstep. And they've seen wave after wave Putin expanding Russia. So surely what we also have to do here, not just get Putin to the table, that's been done and that's a good thing. Somehow, Ukraine is going to need some security guarantees, isn't it?
Yeah, and here's how you get those security. There's several ways to skin this cat. Number one, why was Putin able to invade Ukraine during the Biden administration, during the Obama administration, not during the Trump administration? Because economic situation, Donald Trump's energy policies, frankly, bankrupted Russia. They didn't have the money to go to war. I don't trust Vladimir Putin, but if he doesn't have the money to go to war, he can't go to war. So President Trump's energy policies are going to once again put Russia in a position where it doesn't have the money. The other thing is, one of the ways you guarantee their security is, look, if the United States is in there, and a lot of the rare earth minerals are in eastern Ukraine, if we're in there on the ground, American engineers, American mining areas. Do you really think the Russians are going to go across the border and kill Americans to get into Ukraine? And then the third thing is, once Ukraine is integrated into the Western economy, the other issues aren't as important. Ukraine could be Poland. And I want to tell you, the first week that Donald Trump was in office last time, he took a phone call from Angela Merkel, and she immediately said, "What are you going to do about Ukraine?" And he said, "Well, what are you going to do about Ukraine? It's your neighborhood, not mine." Clink. And when you look at the other countries in Europe, not Poland, not Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, but where's the money? What are they showing up with? They're not putting their money where their mouth is, which is one of the reasons they're not at the table.
This is a big point because President Clinton, President Obama, I think even Bush said to European nations, you know, we're not going to go on paying the lion's share of NATO. It's not fair on American taxpayers. You guys are relying on us. And kind of Trump said it in his first term, and quite a few countries did increase their spending. But are we now at a point with NATO where unless they get serious, there's a real possibility that America says, guys, we're not going to go on with this?
What kind of an alliance is it if one country is providing the security for everybody else? It's not much of an alliance. And when President Trump is, look, it's a shock treatment. He's like taking him by the shoulders and say, pay up, pay up, pay up. And unless you do, we might leave. And maybe that's what it takes, because as you point out, going back to Kennedy, our presidents have said, you're not paying your fair share. Barack Obama called the European allies freeloaders. But only Donald Trump was able to get them to take some money out of their pocketbook and pay.
Well, I hope after all the disunity that was seen in Paris last week in terms of how European countries respond, I hope they're listening. Final thought on all of this, and it's probably quite low down the American agenda because you've got Ukraine, you've got Middle East, all these huge issues. But the Chagos Islands, Diego Garcia, that military base, it really does matter to America, doesn't it?
It is a huge aspect of the U.S.-British, security situation. We test our weapons there. It's a great base for us to use for our Navy, for our Marines. It's an essential thing, and it's something that Britain can do for us that we can't really do for ourselves. And then, what if Britain leaves? Who comes in? China's going to be there in a 5-minute second. They're going to come in and they're going to do what they've done to the islands in the South China Sea, what they've done to the Panama Canal.
But we'll be told, Katie, oh no, the treaty won't allow it.
Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Look at the Panama Canal. The Chinese control both edges of the Panama Canal. Look at Hong Kong. What have they done with Hong Kong? Look at those islands in the South China Sea where the Chinese said, oh no, we're just going to put a few fishing vessels there. Well, now they're fully militarized islands. That's the future of Diego Garcia, if you leave.
Thank you very much indeed for joining me. Back to the studio in London, where I'm joined by former Minister Tom Pursglove and Eric McElroy, who is a member of Democrats Abroad and host of the American Exchange podcast. Eric, you heard Katie McFarlane there. Are you satisfied with what Trump's doing in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, he said that he was going to create peace on day one, and as you mentioned, we're day 30, although it feels like it's day 562 that Trump has been in office. I mean, there's one person responsible for this war. There's one person who could bring peace tomorrow, and that's Vladimir Putin. He's the one that started this war. He's the one who could end it right now. And I think the responsibility and burden should be placed solely on him. And victim shaming the Ukrainian people is totally the wrong way to go, which is what Donald Trump is doing right now.
Okay, Tom. Obviously you were there in government when this war started. Boris was a big cheerleader for defending Ukraine. Is there enough so far in what you've seen for Ukraine?
So I think that actually we should be proud of the consensus that we've had in the United Kingdom in supporting Ukraine. We should all be very concerned about Western security. I actually welcome the fact that the US administration has brought about having these peace talks. I hope that they will move forward. I hope that they will be more inclusive. But I also do accept, actually, that there is a greater role for us to play within NATO, particularly when it comes to spending. That alarm was raised many years ago by the Obama administration. I don't think the UK government has gripped that soon enough. I think the time has come. But what is clear is that we and the Americans need to play our part, along with our European neighbours, in providing those security guarantees that you've touched on. And I think that Boris has raised a very good point as well about unlocking some of those sanctioned funds to pay for some of this, if that helps to move this forward.
Yeah, something like $200 billion worth of Russian assets being held, I'm told, in Belgian banks at the moment. Eric, NATO has been there since the late 1940s. Trump, it always appeared in the past, Trump would threaten NATO members just to get them to pay more. But do you get the feeling that if Europe doesn't pay up, this really could become a major rift?
Well, I mean, it could. I mean, you have to kind of wonder why Trump is doing some of the things he's doing. He's always admired authoritarian figures like Putin. Is this going to give him, if he gives Ukraine to Putin, does this help him justify going into Panama and Greenland and his own imperialistic desires, rather than, and potentially leaving NATO, as he's teased doing in the past as well? I mean, if anything, the one thing that Putin has done is unify NATO more than ever before Trump came back into power, in getting Finland and Norway to join. So the opposite has been true all along for what Putin has done. He's overplayed his hand. Again, it's his fault that we're in this situation, and that's where the focus should still be.
Well, more members may have joined NATO, that's certainly true, and more members are paying 2%, but very few are actually taking defence really seriously. And Eric, when it came to Paris last week, sitting around the table, the European leaders couldn't agree on anything.
Well, we know that you're a fan of how Europeans agree on things, but they should definitely, this is a crisis that's happening in Europe, but it's a crisis that's affecting Western democracies all around the world. So I think for the U.S. to step away from it is not the right way to show leadership in this. Yes, push our European allies to do as much as they can, but keeping the pressure on Russia from a united Europe and a united U.S. and a united NATO is a much more effective way to get things done and negotiate on behalf of the people of Ukraine.
Final thought, Tom, on this segment. Is Keir Starmer right to try to be a bridge between Europe and America?
I would always hope that a UK Prime Minister would fill that role as part of the international negotiations and to make sure that we're showing leadership here in Europe. I really welcome that, actually, and I hope that, as I touched on, that political consensus that we've seen in this country, where there has been a real unity of purpose in supporting Ukraine, will continue to hold. I think when you look around the continent, Germany's obviously in a state of flux with an election imminent. President Macron has got real political challenges at home. I don't see many alternatives, actually, to Keir Starmer in taking the lead on this, given that geopolitical environment and those domestic situations at home in those respective countries. And I would always want the UK to be at the forefront of that. I think we need to match that with resources. I don't blame President Trump for raising that point, but I do hope that we can move this forward in partnership with the US to move this situation along. There's been far too much bloodshed. This is an appalling conflict. President Putin's aggression should be called out for what it is, but we do need to see peace, and I hope that's where we'll get to.
Well, there'll be some big conversations in the White House next week when Keir Starmer arrives there.